Modern representative government is usually described as an achievement of high-minded philosophy. In reality, the engine of democracy started as a desperate scheme for cash. In the 13th century, English monarchs held theoretical absolute power, but they were perpetually bankrupt. The cost of maintaining constant wars in Scotland and France was exorbitant, leaving the royal treasury chronically empty. To bridge the gap, the crown relied on raw extraction. Royal officials carried out prizes, the forced seizure of private property, and levied heavy taxes on wool exports. This direct confiscation of wealth made the crown a predator to its own nobility. Early taxation was a form of legalized extortion rather than a civic contribution. This constant physical drain on the nation's resources made the monarchy brittle, leaving it dangerously vulnerable to an armed uprising. By 1295, Edward I realized that continuing to seize property by force would trigger civil war. He needed a more reliable way to fund his campaigns. He summoned what became the model parliament, invoking the legal principle that what touches all should be approved of all. For the first time, knights and burgesses were brought into the royal council to represent their local communities. This inclusion provided the crown with a high degree of administrative efficiency. By forcing representatives to travel to Westminster and publicly agree to a tax, Edward guaranteed the money would be collected without resistance in the shires. Edward still viewed these laws as temporary concessions. In 1297, he avoided adding permanent clauses to Magna Carta itself, issuing a separate document instead, a maneuver that allowed him to revoke his promises later by claiming they were made under duress. Edward I treated Parliament as a disposable fundraising tool. He died unaware that he had built the structural trap that his successors would eventually be unable to escape. The transition to a weaker monarch changed the power dynamic. Edward II inherited the throne in 1307, but he abandoned the war efforts in Scotland while continuing to drain the treasury for his personal court. Edward further insulted the nobility by granting massive wealth and titles to his personal favorite, Piers Gaveston, an upstart of humble origins who treated the senior earls with open contempt. The barons were finished with traditional rebellion. They realized that the parliamentary bureaucracy created to extract their wealth could be used to seize control of the government itself. The legal machinery of the state was now being reverse-engineered. The nobility understood that if they could control the flow of money, they could effectively strip the king of his prerogative. In 1311, a council known as the Lords Ordainers imposed the Ordinances, a series of regulations that placed the king's administrative powers under baronial supervision. The most significant blow to the crown was fiscal. The ordinances demanded all royal revenues be diverted away from the king's private household and paid into the exchequer, making every penny subject to public scrutiny. These rules also mandated annual parliaments and Gaveston's banishment, effectively building a structural cage around the monarch. When the king resisted, the struggle turned bloody. The earls executed Gaveston, and eventually Edward's own wife, Queen Isabella, led an invasion to remove him from power. In 1327, Parliament was used to formally depose an anointed king. Edward II was held in captivity until he was likely murdered, proving the crown was no longer untouchable. The community of the realm had learned how to break a monarch. They had taken a tool originally designed for royal extortion and used it to dismantle the king himself. When Edward III seized power from his mother's lover, Roger Mortimer, he faced a fractured nation. He realized the monarchy would only survive if it could channel the dangerous energy of the barons into something useful. Edward co-opted the nobility through a shared culture of chivalry. He hosted massive, highly visible tournaments and feasts, unifying the aristocracy under his own leadership through the theater of the joust. He also changed how the crown used Parliament. Instead of demanding taxes, he used the sessions to seek the barons' consent for the 100 Years' War, turning his potential rivals into invested partners in his conquests. This strategy worked. Edward III shifted Parliament from a site of baronial resistance into a reliable engine for international warfare, securing his reign by making the nobility stakeholders in his success. Over a century of conflict, what began as a collection of temporary ceremonial meetings settled into a permanent structural shift in how the state functioned. It created a powerful legal fiction, a representational body with the recognized authority to bind every person in the kingdom to its decisions. Similar assemblies were appearing across the Latin Christian world, from the Cortes of Portugal to the same in Poland. This widespread mix of petitioning and voting patterns gradually formed a common European tradition of parliamentary culture. Modern representative institutions are survivors of a long, painful struggle for control. They began as instruments of royal extortion, but over centuries of friction, they were slowly turned back upon the very powers that built them.